Hello and welcome everyone. Thanks for joining. I'm David Widmar, providing you with a little bit of an update out of this latest WASDE estimate, putting in the context of the yields and yield forecast challenge that we've been talking about. So just going to dive right in here today. One of the things we've seen on corn is we see production, continuing to tighten, especially around yields, but the stocks have been continuing to stick up there, been pretty sticky, remaining pretty high. So where are we at for this? Well, last year, 10.2% stocks to use. The year before, 9.2%. Now we're sitting in this 15% stocks to use. It's above the long run average of 13%. And so despite these lower yields that we've been seeing coming out in the last few months, we're having a hard time escaping the gravity of this big area planted, these 94 million acres planted. So of course, the current yield estimates at 175.1. And we can see that this put us into an ending stock situation a little closer to 2.2 billion, but still above that 2 billion. What happened here is the USDA trimmed production through lower yields, but also we see a little bit of an increase here in the beginning stocks, and then we also saw a little bit of decline in usage. So this left the ending stock situation, or the usage situation, actually down a little bit. So not as optimistic as we would have thought if we just looked at the yield story in and of itself. So how do we think about the yields and how significant the current yield situation is? And what we've done here is we've said, okay, let's look at all the historic departures from the trend. Those of you familiar with the yield guide know, we plot the yields over time, we put a trend line, we measure that, and we say, okay, at 170 5.1 bushel per acre, we're about 6.4 bushels from the trend line. And where does that put us? Well, that puts us right in between here, 1991 and 2002. So right off the bat, we can share, this is the lowest yield. This is the lowest departure from trend that we've seen since 2012. That's one way of framing that. This data frame it just a little bit, but if you think about 2012, of course, is a much bigger 35 bushel below trend line. We're only 6 below. But when you start looking at this, there's a few really big years out in here, but we're not quite nearly to that level. We're sitting right here at about 6.4 bushels below the trend line, and we haven't seen a yield this far from the trend line in recent years. Now, if you looked at posted yields, you're going to see something very, very different. So again, this is not posted yields. This is the departure from the trend line, which is we think a better way of thinking about this when you want to provide historic context, but what we've been seeing and what we've been going on. So as you can see, all the range of possible outcomes, 2023 is shaping up to be the 7th lowest yield in 35 years, or in the 20th percentile of yields. So this is a fairly historically low likely event. We just haven't seen a whole lot of these. Now it's still in this 175 range that we've been stuck in the last few years. So it feels like it's not that much different than what we've seen in the last several years, but it is historically becoming a bigger and bigger departure from trend. Again, I think this provides some context with, okay, we have a yield in the 20th percentile, but we have really burdensome stocks. And this tells us just how big this acreage story has become and how burdensome that has been on the balance sheets when we look at production. Shifting gears a little bit, looking at soybeans. Soybeans have started to tighten the stocks use. We're at 5.8% last year, 6.1% the year before. The long run average is 8.2%. And so we've seen some tightening here with the USDA pulling about dropping yields from 52 bushels to 50.9, so a little more than a bushel per acre coming out of those yields. Of course, they have the opposite story. They have 83.5 million acres planted, a fairly low number. So what we have here is ending stocks dropping to 245 million bushels. Now, if you look at the last 2 years, we see that ending stocks are now lower, projected to be lower than they were in the previous 2 years. But at the same time, one of the other factors impacting the stocks to use ratio is that usage is also down. We were at 4.4 billion bushels 2 years ago, 4.3 billion bushels last year. Now we're at 4.2.5 billion bushels. So the stocks to use ratio is being impacted by lower usage and lower stocks. And so this is part of what happens when you have really high commodity prices. Where are relative yields today? Well, we're at 50.9 bushels, which is about 0.4 bushels below the trend line. It's about the 14th lowest trend that we've seen in 35 years, or the 40th percentile. So not nearly as concerning of a yield story. But I think these two charts help you put some context into where these yields are in historic performance. If it kind of feels like, well, we haven't pulled these yields quite low enough, this is a different way of looking about that, a little different way of thinking about our observations. Of course, this WASDE report closed 2 questions within the forecast network in those yield contest challenge that we have ongoing throughout the entire summer and into the fall. So the contest is half over, and then it opens 2 new questions. So make sure you log your forecasts and expectations for that. So here's where the yield forecast challenge stands today through the August WASDE, and big congratulations out to Stephen from Indiana, who has won the first half of the contest. Now the contest is still ongoing. You can still earn points to go towards the grand total, and you can also you're very much active to win the second half of the contest leaderboard prize. Now, I want to share a little personal observation. I was doing pretty well, but the last 2 reports really knocked me out of contention. There's a few really good forecasters out there that have racked up a lot of points in the last 2 or 3 WASDE reports. That has not been me. But I can tell you what happens is if you stub your toe here, you can have a change in fortunes pretty carefully. So I was doing really well in May and June, haven't done nearly as well the last 2 months, but I'm still active, still look forward to putting a lot more points on the board, hopefully pulling back into the lead. And I think you can do that just the same. So that's all we have for this update. Again, keep an eye on these yield projections. Keep in mind that corn yields are on the low end of historic outcomes, and keep in mind we're a long ways from 2012 like outcomes, but we're still in the historic low end of the range. So it's this acre stories that we're gonna have to overcome and deal with as we head into 2024 and the stock situation that unfolds between now and then. Until next time, stay curious.